Hello, good evening. I'm Menon Rebecca from the Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, and I am here to moderate the fourth session of this international lecture series. So this session is entitled The Colonial Archives and Beyond, and the speaker is distinguished Professor Dilip Menon. He's a professor of Indian Studies at the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa. So we are moving to the next phase of this lecture, and I would like to welcome Nitin A., MPhil Scholar of the Department of History, to welcome the gathering. Welcome, Nitin.
Hello, evening. Here we have the eminent scholar Dilip Menon from the University of Witwatersrand, whose knowledge in many fields of history is renowned worldwide. We are really fortunate to have you here, sir. It's my privilege to welcome Dilip Menon from the fourth session of webinar series on behalf of Kerala Council for Historical Research and the Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit. Professor Dilip Menon is the Mellon Chair in Indian Studies at the University of Witwatersrand and the Director of the Center for Indian Studies in Africa. He was educated at Oxford and Cambridge and has taught at Hyderabad and Delhi before moving to South Africa. He is a social and cultural historian and works on issues of caste and equality in modern India through history, film, and literature. Over the past 10 years, he has been working with the histories of Indian Ocean and questions of knowledge from the global south. His publications include Caste, Nationalism, and Communism in South India. He has recently published an edited volume titled Capitalisms Towards a Global History, which was published by Oxford and is the editor of a forthcoming volume, Changing Theory, Concepts from the Global South, which will be published by Routledge in next year. I welcome the distinguished speakers of the day, Professor Dilip Menon, to deliver the lecture.
So this new normal platform is earlier, sir. We are looking forward for a more exciting lecture, and welcome, sir.
Okay, thank you. So this, I suppose this means that I can start speaking now that the baton has been passed to me after three others. So thank you all. Thank you, Sheba, in particular, for inviting me to join this series of lectures by some of the most distinguished historians of Kerala and of India. And I suppose all of us will be thinking about the archives through our own engagement with the archives, our historical work over the past so many years and so on. And the archives, as most of us are aware, are the fetish object of the historian. We're always told we must go to the archives. Very often for historians, methodology consists not so much in an engagement with social and theoretical disciplines, but in the manner in which one goes to the archives, one walks to the archive or cycles to the archives and so on. But the archives are there at the heart of the discipline, and it's only of late that particularly within the Indian historical profession, that we have managed to think beyond to oral sources, doing anthropology, engaging with film, literature, and a marvelous bunch of younger Malayali scholars have begun to engage with what is called cultural history, but is actually within the larger remit of history itself. And since there are going to be so many of us speaking about the archives, I will try and present before you a set of observations. I'll hopefully say something intelligent and thought-provoking. And as we know, history doesn't repeat itself, but historians do. So over the course of these many lectures, you will probably get a lot of reiterations of arguments that have been that can be made regarding the status of the archives, on the necessity of having an institution such as the archives, and there's also the problems of the information that comes to be collated in an archive, which tends to be tendentious at best. So one of the things we need to remember is that the historical discipline itself has undergone many transformations from the time of the Renaissance, when it was one with disciplines like rhetoric and poetry, and the idea of history being some kind of adjudicator of the truth in some absolute sense had not really set in. So if one goes back to the Aristotelian distinction, where historians tell of things that have been and poets of things as they might be, in the Renaissance, this distinction was not hard and fast. And it's only by the 17th century with the French legal tradition that you have the idea of the historian as a judge, as somebody who is an arbiter of evidence, who weighs the evidence, passes judgment on individuals, on events, decides on questions of importance, questions of truth, and so on, began to set in. And only towards the latter part of the 19th century do we have the emergence of the idea of history as the largely in the manner in which we practice it, where history comes to be recast as the biography of the state. And the state becomes the obscure object of desire, the writing, the coming into existence of the state, coming into existence of the nation, the idea of the nation state. These become the cluster of ideas around which histories come to be written. So the influence of Hegel, the influence of Ranke, and the idea that the archives constituted by the state, which are a record of the state's activities and inquiries over a period of time, that these become the source for writing the history of the nation state. This becomes an idea that comes into existence by the early 20th century. So this is a kind of speedy, like history of history in 10.5 chapters version. But what I wanted to do is to kind of set in place certain things, which we shall hopefully return to later. We all know also that there have been extensive critiques of the idea of the archive. Many of you might be familiar with the works of Jacques Derrida. You might be familiar with Arjuna Padare's critique of the Colonial Archive, Arlette Farge, Catherine Hall. There have been multiple critiques that have emerged on the idea of the archive as some kind of stable source of information, stable, unprejudiced source of information. And the critiques of the archive have actually taken up issues like the fact that the archive represents the state's ambition, as it were, to map on to a territory and a people, an ambition that is never really realized. In some sense, it's a bit like drawing a map of a country, and a map is always drawn to some kind of scale. And the scale is never 1:1. A map never maps onto the territory entirely. Similarly, what you get from the archives never really renders the histories of a nation and of a people entirely transparent. There is also the fact that the state's ambition, whether it's territorial in terms of its reach or epistemic in terms of producing knowledge for the space over which it putatively governs, there's also the idea of overreach, that states very often aspire to a control that it never really manages to achieve. That there is resistance along the margins, there are constant frictions that happen, constant insurrections, what Foucault called the insurrections of subordinate knowledges, as well as the insurrections of subordinate peoples, which militate against the establishment of a stable entity, the state, a stable entity called the nation, and a stable entity of source called the archive. So in one sense, it has been argued by many that the archives represent more a state of anxiety. It's a state of anxiety about the state's desire for control. It's not about the state's actual control. That's this desire for control is what is manifested in the vast production of documents within the archive. And there is also what Arjuna Padare has pointed to, that there is the attempt to control the disorderliness of the world through a production of information. So anyone who has worked in the archives at any point in time know that there is an immense production of information. So you go to the Dutch archive, there are 93 kilometers of files that you could walk through. You go to the India Office Library or the British Library. Again, it's a almost, you could imagine like a double marathon if you were to run through the files that actually deal with a vast amount of information. Now, the question is how much of this information is actually useful, how much can be retained, how much can be worked with in order to produce a historical writing which actually maps on to some the forms of life that exist in the world out there. But given the fact that there has been such a critique of the ambitions of the archive and the nation state, One of the things that we need to remember and has been pressing on our conscience of late has also been the fact that we live in a time of authoritarian regime. So regardless of whether we are in Turkey, in Russia, in India, under the Hindu majoritarian regime, or in the United States, what we have are attempts by the state to control forms of dissent, control minorities, and control forms of political activity which are seen in the peculiar language that we use in India as anti-national, and so on and so forth. So again, we have the state's ambition to control the criticism that arises of its actions, as also the production of a vast amount of information through which order is sought to be brought into the world. So if you think about recent absurdities, for example, so you had the pogrom in Delhi earlier this year when the Bharatiya Janata Party and its minions engaged in attacks on Muslims. Large numbers of Muslims were killed. The charge sheet that was filed, of course, did not include any of the BJP's cooperators or politicians. 15 people were accused, most of whom were associated with the Citizenship Amendment Act and the protests against it. But the charge sheet ran to 17,500 pages. Right? So that's a vast amount of information, useless or otherwise, but which has been marshaled by the state in order to depict what they see as a frenetic anti-national activity that is going on in India. If you think about Omar Khalid, who is a student activist from Jawaharlal Nehru University, in the process of his indictment, he was shown 1.1 million pages of documents against him. Right? Now, this is an absurd amount of information against any one individual. Right? You can probably 1.1 million pages could be used to write the history of civilization as we know it. But this range of charges against him has also generated an archive against dissentient practices in India. And we are, in some sense, drawn back to earlier characterizations of such amassing of information. We've seen this happen in the Soviet Union. We have seen this happen in Nazi Germany. We've also seen this happen in Eastern Europe, where the Czech writer Milan Kundera said the police files are our only claim to immortality. Right? And in one sense, that is the state we are in India right now. So even as we have this idea of the archives as an unstable entity, we're also very conscious, we should be conscious of the fact that it is precisely the state creating a record of its own activities that holds it accountable within the space that we know as democracy. So while we have the idea of habeas corpus, produce the body, which is central to the practice of a free and democratic life under authoritarian regimes, and also to prevent the onset of authoritarianism. Under international human rights law, you have the idea of habeas data, right? Which has been implemented in Latin America and in South America over the past 2 decades. We've seen the whole range of dictatorships in Chile, in Argentina, and so on, people being disappeared, and so on and so forth. And the idea of habeas data has become crucial in order to record the disappearances, record the lives of activists who have been removed from the face of the earth. And the only way of bringing that dissent back to life and bringing the historical activity back to life is the archive kept by the state. So we're in an ironic kind of situation that we have to depend on the state in order to record its iniquities, as so to speak. So under the idea of habeas data, individuals can petition governments for any information held against them. And more crucially, state destruction of evidence is seen as a form of violence against its citizens. So when we think about this 1 million pages of documents against Omar Khalid, there's a 17,500 page charge sheet, there is something about the absurdity of excess, right? But at the same time, that this constitutes a body of evidence that allows us or allows a later generation to go back to see the trace of the ways in which states have arraigned people who they see as its opponents. And so, for example, this is something that few of you may know. Apart from habeas data, there is also the establishment of the right to truth. So 24th March is celebrated by the United Nations as the International Day for the right to the truth concerning gross human rights violations and for the dignity of victims. And 24th March was chosen as the date because it was the date when the Salvadorian Archbishop Oscar Romero was assassinated in 1980. So in that sense, the archive stands at the heart of the formation of states, stands at the formation, heart of the relation between states and citizens, stands at the heart of the possibility of a democratic practice. So this is something we need to remember even as we engage in a critique of the idea of the archive. A very important book that came out a few years ago by a historian called Kirsten Weld, which looks at the archives of dictatorship in Guatemala. And the reason why I'm speaking about this is that we live in the times that we do, right? Where, given the fact of lockdown, there are vast areas of governmental activity right now in India which are not transparent. Parliament has become more or less a farce where bills are passed. The Farm Bill was passed with precipitate haste, right, without too much of a discussion. And there is a lot that is happening in India where, because of the shutdown of civil society, we are not aware. And to get back to this issue of the archives of dictatorship in Guatemala, again, some of you may know that Guatemala in 1954, there was a coup engineered by the CIA, beginning the long series of American interventions to disrupt democracies all over the world. And 1954, the coup was followed by 36 years, a civil war between 1960 and 1996. 200,000 people were disappeared. But that's really a count that we have. It's possible that larger numbers had vanished. But very recently, there was a discovery, quite by accident, by human rights activists in a former torture chamber of over 80 million decaying pages, right? And which had around 250,000 identity cards of people who had been brought in, tortured, killed, detained, and then killed. So suddenly, as Kirsten Wells's resonant phrase has it, these are paper cadavers, paper corpses. So these identity cards allow you then, this archive allows you then to recreate the lives of these brave, courageous people who laid down their lives really for the institution of Guatemala as a nation. And they have to be resurrected, as it were. And history, in many senses, is an act of resurrection of past lives, past imaginations, and so on. And history is not only a study of the past. This is something that we study at school. History is a study of the past. But it's quite clear, increasingly to us, that history cannot merely be a study of the past. History is a study of matters of the past and the present, and one can go on with multiple qualifiers of that kind. Now, to move on from there, if one thinks about the ideologies that lie behind history writing, and to go back to some of the themes that I spoke about, the idea of the archive, the archive as the biography of the nation state, the archive as a source for writing the history of the nation state, and so on. Being a colonized nation, right? India being a colonized nation, one of the primary ideologies that was the driver behind the writing of history was the search for the state and the search for politics, that India, in past times, had stable formations, political formations. The critique provided by colonial discourse that India was a site of internecine warfare, political turmoil, the inability for people to come together in order to found stable formations. All of this was reacted against in the search for states and the search for empires. So it's not surprising that when we study ancient India, for example, we have a long run of empires, starting from the Mauryas through to the Guptas, to Chola, to Vijayanagar, to the Bahmani, to the Mughal. So Indian history comes to be written through this set of stable political formations. And if you read Nilakanta Shastri's work on the Cholas, you would imagine that the Cholas were the forerunners of the Indian civil service. And there's a Byzantine civil service, there are departments and there are undersecretaries and so on and so forth. So this critique under colonialism of the lack of political authority, the lack of political order, produced a history that said we had all of this and more. Going back to the vast reaches of time, we had republicanism, we had forms of democratic discussions among the Lichavis, and so on and so forth. Right? And the idea that there was anarchy in the 18th century, and the idea that after the Mughals and prior to the coming of the East India Company and then the subsequent establishment of colonial rule was a period of anarchy, was again a characterization that arose out of this deep desire to show that states existed and that political order is associated with the existence of states and empires. In modern India, I mean, when you think about the period from around 1800s onwards, the search has been largely within the archives and in the historiography for the search for resistance. That colonialism, which is seen as a monolithic formation, was met by another monolithic ideology of nationalism that people deep wellsprings of patriotism and nationalism drove peasants, tribals, the middle classes, vast swathes of people in a spate of resistance against the colonial regime. And the search has been for an evidence of nationalist sentiment. And this has caused multiple, how shall I put it, multiple distortions in our understanding of how political activity came to be constituted and came to be practiced over a 100-200-year period. So, to give you some random examples again, and you think about more contemporary period, and you think about the period in the 1940s, the run up to independence. I mean, there's a kind of teleology. So you start in 1757 and then you write history backwards from 1947. So from 1757 on, there's a growing swell which reaches a climax in 1947, as it were. So if you think about the 1940s, the Indian National Army is, the activities of the Indian National Army are given short shrift because of that dubious alliance, the idea of people who have left the army, who have reneged, the idea of an alliance of Subhash Chandra Bose with fascism, which is seen as the major threat. There's a preference for the Royal India Mutiny, which is seen as more purely nationalist in its manifestation. Similarly, there has been a kind of sidelining of caste movements and religious movements, which are seen as aberrations. The need was for a nationalist class unity. Caste movements were seen as being too fragmented, too narrow. So if you think about that standoff between Gandhi and Ambedkar, one reason why we don't study Ambedkar seriously is largely because he's seen as someone who practiced a narrow parochial imagination as against the nationalist imagination. Of course, Ambedkar has been vindicated in contemporary India, and possibly if Gandhi was a figure of the 20th century, Ambedkar is the figure of the 21st century. Similarly, when you think about ways in which the archives were read for the history of the Muslims, there was again a reading backwards from 1947, and the idea of Muslim religious or social activity was largely subsumed under the idea of communalism. So the search for arguments were governed by very often the kind of paradigm of nationalism and the idea of going to the colonial archive in order to study and get evidence to understand these phenomena, rather than departing from the colonial archive in order to ask what else was happening. So, for example, we tend to think about colonial India, right, from around 1857 to 1947, but there was much that was happening in India, movements of people, movements of ideas, which are not entirely determined by the presence of the British. If you think about Benedict Anderson's book, where he calls The Spectres of Comparison, where he talks about colonized countries and the idea of a double consciousness, that in colonized spaces, whether French colonies or English colonies, that people within the colonies always had a double consciousness, a consciousness of belonging to their spaces and at the same time the metropolis. So to think about Delhi and London simultaneously, Batavia and Amsterdam simultaneously, and so on and so forth. But this is to subsume all of here in an Indian imagination into an imagination created by colonialism and empire, which is not entirely true. So we probably need to think with ideas like para-colonial rather than pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial, that even at the under colonialism and at the time of colonialism, there were multiple imaginations that worked with diverse temporalities, occupied different spaces, and the colonial archive doesn't really manage to capture this. And I'll go on to speak a bit more about all of this shortly. So if you think about the idea of writing the history of Islam, for example, very often the history of Islam is written backwards from the idea of Pakistan emerging, right? So just as much as 1947 results in the emergence of India, 1947 also results in the emergence of Pakistan. And there's a whole trajectory of the history of Muslims in India which seems to lead towards that. What is left out of this engagement, which takes up Muslim social reform, it takes up Muslim social agitations, it looks at the colonial archive. What is left out is the vast engagement across a much larger space of Islam, so that you have the idea of Indian Ocean Islam, right, which is now being worked upon by people like Yasser Arafat, people like Mahmoud Kuria, who look at the affiliations of Indian Muslims with a much larger territory extending all the way from Southeast Asia through to the Middle East, right? Extending across the ocean, a notion of space, a notion of time, a notion of ethics, a notion of social being, and that the colonial archives hardly exhaust this, right? The colonial archive gives you the history of the Muslims in the putative space that we call India or South Asia. So the question that we have to ask is how do we move beyond the colonial archive? And that's a question that have not been addressing directly, but I shall keep returning to it as I go along. So if you think about what constitutes the colonial archive, the strategic information, I mean, when you think about what are archives all about, and we spoke a bit about some of the excesses of the archive, the ambitions of the state and so on, colonial archives were created with the idea of strategic information, and strategic information meaning information that is towards the idea of rule and of governance and of the management of and containment of the idea of deviance, right? So you have forms of and deviance in terms of forms of political opposition. So the colonial archives give you a sense of how carefully the colonial state monitored the activities of particular individuals, particular organizations, which of course they inflated the danger of, and very similar to what is happening right now in India, where somebody like Omar Khalid is seen as a threat to the nation, right? I mean, a person who has said in so many ways about his idea of a nonviolent India and of a nonviolent political practice. So when one thinks about the colonial archive and its the gathering of strategic information for rule, the containment of deviance, whether it's political opposition or even things like people who appear on the margins of society. So you've settled agricultural society, pastoralist groups, tribal groups are seen as on the margins, are seen as people who cannot be contained within the colonial apparatus of government. You have the deviance from sexual norms. So the fear, for example, of forms of society like matrilineal, which was seen as aberrant, matrilineal in Kerala, forms of sociality like homosexuality, or those who escape these binaries like eunuchs. So within the colonial archive, there are a bunch of anxieties which are being managed, which are about how best to rule or govern a country, how best to create a uniformity that is easier to administer, to erase and to efface, and to, in some sense, classify forms of deviance, forms of difference, and to create, amidst this rule of amidst these differences, a sense of order. So in that sense, when you look at the archive, what the archive reveals is less than information about the society that was being ruled and more the anxieties of the rulers about the possibilities of governance of the space. I'll just talk about two themes here as to what makes it into the archive and what constitutes an archive, what doesn't make it into the archive. So if you think about the census reports, you think about land settlement reports, you think about native newspaper reporting, most of us who work on modern India are familiar with multiple forms of reports that are generated, which are seen, and you would go to the home political files, or you go to the revenue files, and so on and so forth. But there are, in the early stages of colonialism, one could also talk about what I would like to call the abandoned archives. So if one thinks about Nicholas Dirks's work, the historian Nicholas Dirks's work on the writings of Colin Mackenzie, on the work done by Colin Mackenzie in the late 18th century. Colin Mackenzie was to go on to become the first Surveyor General of India. And Colin Mackenzie in the late 18th century was concerned with the enterprise of finding out about local customs, local culture, religion, traditions, the histories of local landlords. He was concerned with everything that lay before him on the landscape that he occupied, because at that point, the idea of empire had not gelled, right? And for him, this was his way of knowing the lay of the land, knowing the customs of the people, knowing the varieties of people that occupied a landscape, all of which was going to be set aside once the central fact of colonialism became to govern the country. So in that sense, to know about local cults or local religions were irrelevant to the larger enterprise of governance, which was to govern India and ensure the regular payment of revenue, ensure law and order, and these minute variations of the indigenous imagination were really quite inconsequential. So Colin Mackenzie's entire archive comes to be abandoned until it's revived in some sense in the academic work produced by Nicholas Dirks. Similarly, in my own work, I've engaged with the vast holdings of someone called Alexander Walker of Boland, who came over to Malabar as a very young man to fight against Tipu Sultan with the East India Company. He gets, in some sense, like Colin Mackenzie, he's entranced and he's enchanted by the variety of historical imaginations, the multiple social practices, and he produces a vast archive before he retires as the governor of Baroda, right? He moves on along the west coast, upwards along the west coast of Baroda, finally moves back to Scotland, and the Walker of Boland papers are held in the National Library of Scotland. So he produces a 4-volume history of Malabar, a 4-volume history of caste, and all of these are produced through an engagement with native intellectuals. He tells you who he spoke with, who were his interlocutors. Some of them are Nayars, some of them were Iravas. And Walker of Boland also produces for us the first English rendition of the Keralolpati. You'll find discussions of the Keralolpati in William Logan, for example, but Walker of Boland's unpublished manuscripts have the first English translation of the Keralolpati, and which I've written, or I'm in the process of writing a paper on. But this is another abandoned archive because all of Walker of Boland's work seemed to be quite irrelevant, quite besides the point for the instrumentality of colonial rule. Because there was, in some sense, an attempt by both Colin Mackenzie and Alexander of Boland to generate an affinity with forms of imagination, forms of life, which was really not the enterprise of colonialism in its more mature phases. A second issue that we could think about, besides the abandoned archives, is the fact that the colonial archive embodies a certain form of terrestrial imagination. And this is something that has been an issue that I've been working with as to why the ocean is set aside in many of the writings on the history of India. So you have those who work on the ocean. So you have Ashin Das Gupta, Lakshmi Subramaniam, Sanjay Subramaniam, who work on the ocean, the rest of the people who work on land. And those who work on the land never talk about the ocean, and so on and so forth. So we think about the colonial archive. The colonial archive is also characterized by forms of rule, a terrestrial imagination that is concerned with settlement, revenue settlements, law and order. For those of us who were undergraduates, unfortunate undergraduates way back in the 1980s, most of what we studied in modern Indian history was the permanent settlement, Rayatwari settlement, Bhaiyachara, Mahalwari, and it went on. Right? We studied various forms of revenue settlement and the details of defalcation, restraint, non-payment of revenue, rent, so on and so forth. The idea was that the empire in India was premised on land, right? And that also was seen as encompassing the Indian imagination. It's very interesting what happens here, that the colonial closing of the mind, creating a particular terrestrial geography, also accorded with the imagination of a Hindu elite or upper castes, who also saw India as the territory that stretched from the Himalayas to Kanyakumari, and a landed imagination, right? So the colonial imagination and the national elite imagination mapped one onto the other, where the ocean came to be written out. It came to be something on the margins of thought. So interestingly enough, whether you're thinking about Savarkar or Hello? Am I
Yes,
online?
sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. You are audible. You are audible.
You lost me.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
For a
Did you
few
lose me
seconds.
for a while?
No, sir. It's
Okay,
actually
great.
lasted for a few
I don't know.
minutes.
Okay, great. So
Thank you.
I was speaking about the similarity of the imagination of the colonial archive and the upper caste elite archive, or upper caste elite imagination, whether we're thinking about Nehru and Savarkar, both very different in terms of their political ideologies, but in their imagination of India, it's a Himalaya to Kanyakumari kind of idea. The oceanic geographies come to be subordinated. So if you think about what else is happening in colonial India, or if you think with the idea of the para-colonial, the temporalities of mercantile activity, the temporalities of labor continue, right? So you're thinking about the Natagotai Chettiars who are traveling all the way to Southeast Asia, as they have done prior to the coming of colonialism and after the end of colonialism. Or you think about the movements of labor, the Pulayas and Cheramas who are going to Ceylon, traveling to Southeast Asia, to Burma to work in the rice fields. There's multiple movements that are going on, which gets written out. So the concentration on the colonial archive also creates a terrestrial imagination, which leaves out the fact that there are other rhythms of Indian history that continue to be present. And here I'd like to leave you with this image of Fernand Braudel before I move on to the next point. Fernand Braudel, when he talks about 17th century India, he talks about India as a fairly disaggregated entity. And this continues to be true into the colonial period and even beyond, that if you think about the southwest coast of India, it's integrated with the Indian Ocean and its rhythms, whether it's Indian Ocean Islam or the movement of labor, which is why Dubai is like a district of Kerala, right? There's a historical integration with the rhythms of the ocean. We'll return back to this point later. The southeastern or the Coromandel coast is incorporated with Southeast Asia and China. The northwest of India is part of the Ottoman Safavid Empire and multiple other regimes across Central Asia. And you could go on. So this connection of Kerala with Cairo would have been at various points much stronger than the connections of places in Kerala with that of Delhi or Calcutta for that matter. So we need to think about what the closing of the mind that happens when we engage with the colonial archive, when we think about the forms of the abandoned archives, as well as the creation of a terrestrial imagination. Now I'll get on to the last two points that I wish to make, because that will bring me up to it. I mean, I was hoping to speak for not more than 45 minutes, because those are, that is the limit of human tolerance, as we know. I mean, listening to another person's voice, that is. I plan to speak a bit about the subaltern studies enterprise, but we have one of the finest of the subaltern studies historian, Shahid Amin, who will be speaking to you later. And so what I want to do is just briefly talk about what subaltern studies did for us in our relation to the archive and the nature of our engagement with the archive, influenced largely by French structuralism and of the idea of reading the archives against the grain. So the idea that what is in the archives is not merely a source which you transcribe, right? As the English historian Eric Stokes once said, what one clerk says to another is not history. And very often, a lot of the older history writing was merely a transcription of what happened in the colonial archives between English officials onto the pages of a history book. So when one thinks about Ranajit Guha's work, and Ranajit Guha was one of the first persons to alert us to the fact that we need to study the archives as we would study, or the sources in the archives as we would read or study any other text. For example, that what we are dealing with here are the prejudices, in many senses, of colonial officials. We are dealing with the cliches, the historical cliches of the times in terms of the characterization of certain classes of people. How do peasants behave? How do tribals behave? Certain notions of order, certain metaphors that are used to describe situations. So we are dealing with a set of characterizations rather than some kind of historical truth of that period that is being rendered to us. It's also showing us the kinds of anxieties that underlie the enterprise of rule, that when you have a district magistrate reporting on something, this is not a report of fact. It's a report of fantasy very often. It comes out of their mind because they themselves are out of their minds in the middle of rebellions and insurgencies and so on. We're also talking about the effect of time, that a report written closer to the time carries a certain affect as opposed to a report written later, the question of distance. So what Ranajit Guha's prose of counterinsurgency, for example, did was to disaggregate for us the very idea of what exists in the archive, and he taught us how to read a document, keeping in mind the bee in the bonnet of the person who wrote it as much as the circumstances. We also had the marvelous work of people like Gyan Pandey, where his brilliant essay, The Bigoted Julaha, which was about weavers and their seeming predisposition to communal activity, where the Julahas are constantly mentioned, the Julahas of UP are constantly mentioned in colonial archives as being fanatical in temperament, and then he takes apart that whole set of arguments through engagement with the lives and the experiences of the Julahas in order to show us that very often what we see as the predispositions of people are actually governed by the anxieties of those who write about them. So it tells you more about the person who's writing than the person who's written about. Then Gyan Pandey also worked with the small town diarist, the Vakia-e-Hadsat, where he looked at diaries of a person writing in a particular kasbah, recording history. So you have the narrative of a grand history that is provided for us by colonial records and by nationalist writing, and then you have the voice of a person who lives in a kasbah and writes about everyday life. So talking about different registers and levels, something that always exceeds the colonial archive. And one could go on about the multiple ways in which subaltern studies alerted us to the fact that studying the colonial archive as a kind of font of truth was not enough in itself. One of the important things that we need to remember is that what remained in place despite the subaltern studies enterprise, and ironically enough, what remained in place was a very elite paradigm where elites thought and subalterns acted. So while we had detailed and very sensitive explorations of the thought of people like Bankim Chandra, for example, we rarely got an insight into the mind of the subaltern. So the fact of the writings and the imaginations and the lives of peasants and tribals, they were really manifested in terms of the times when they rebelled or they emerged in colonial records as sites of disorder. And interestingly enough, in elementary aspects of peasant insurgency in colonial India, Ranajit Guha is very suspicious about the use of folk sources for recovering the subaltern mind. He sees the implantation of the Trojan horse of elite thought within folk sources and so on and so forth. So again, while there was a critique of the colonial archive and there was still the retaining of a certain elite disposition towards subaltern imaginations, of thinking about the lives, the mental lives of those who are subordinate groups, whether it's Dalits, whether it's women, whether it's peasants, and you could go on, multiply the categories that got excluded in this concentration on elite thought. And in some sense, what this did for a generation that grew up with subaltern studies was to kind of think with the aporia, with the tensions that were there in subaltern studies. So my own study of looking at lower caste novels, looking at the folk performances like the Teyyam and so on was occasioned by a need to depart from this elite paradigm to actually see the Malayan in the forests of Kerala as akin to Bankim Chandra in some senses, in the imagination of worlds, of imagination of descents, imagination of other forms, as reorganizing social relationships and so on. So in that sense, to go back, I mean, to think about what Levi-Strauss said in The Savage Mind, history is a fine departure point in the quest for intelligibility, so long as one gets out of it, right? So this is something that Shahid Amin builds upon when he talks about entering the archive being important, but leaving it being as important, that one has to go through the archive and emerge into a space where one isn't conditioned by the information that the archive gives you. And similarly, again, if you go back to Levi-Strauss, where he says in Tris through Peak, the primary function of writing is to facilitate the enslavement of other human beings. So when you think of actually working with the colonial archive and the written record, we have to ask ourselves, what is it that we are missing out in this? And this inaugurated in many senses the move towards ethnographic writing, engaging with oral sources, and multiple forms that we'll all be talking about over the course of these various lectures. So the spur to thinking about history beyond the archives becomes crucial. And some of you may be again familiar with James Scott's idea in his most recent book of the idea, the thesis of why civilizations cannot climb hills, that there are areas where, like Zomia, in Northeast Asia, the uplands of Northeast Asia, where there are large tracts of land where people live beyond the purview of states, beyond the ability of states to control them, and the idea why civilizations cannot climb hills, and where he argues that what you have here is not the classic trajectory from oral cultures moving to written cultures, but rather written cultures moving to orality, because writing reveals. To be an oral culture renders you illegible to the practices of state governance. So here again, we have to think about the valence or the importance of orality and literacy, the idea of the archive and writing, the idea of entering the archive and departing from the archive as constituting the anxieties of the ruled rather than descriptions of the anxieties of the ruler rather than descriptions of the ruled, and multiple things that I've been speaking about. Finally, and this is the last point that I want to make before I stop, is to try and think about if, as I began by saying, if the archive represents the fetish of the historian and the historical discipline, as it's constituted, because even now, any self-respecting historian is seen as being somebody who has spent hours in the archive, right? They have to have get your fingers dusty in the archive, develop skin irritations and so on through handling 200-year-old files with 200-year-old dust. So alongside the historical discipline, there's also the idea of the historical imagination. And the historical imagination always exceeds the historical discipline. So if you think about the need for history, which was a compulsion in a colonized country, this is something that I spoke about briefly, that the need for a state, the need for a political order has governed our understanding of history in the past, because we were a colonized people and we succumbed to the descriptions offered by colonial writers of the political anarchy that survived or that thrived in our kinds of spaces. So the need for history is something that Partha Chatterjee has written about, for example, where the cry of Bankim Chandra that we need a history, we need a history of our own, we must have a history. And this was a response in many senses to the colonial contempt towards the ungoverned imaginings of natives, right? Where the idea that Indians don't have a sense of history, this is something that, again, we don't need to go into in much detail. All of you are familiar with the works of Ramila Thapar on this. But the emergence of the historical profession in India was under this cloud of anxiety, was under the specter of an absence of historical writing. And the fact that what we had was not historical writing in any sense, that these were ungoverned imaginations, and the fact that there was an embarrassment of time beyond measure. Whereas other people thought in centuries, we thought in yugas, which ran into millions of years and so on. And the idea of we too have a history tended to move us towards a subordination to a historical discipline that was coming into existence at a particular time, representing a particular European paradigm and a particular European colonial paradigm. So that when we have our discussions on history writing in India, very often they take up the emergence of the idea of the historical discipline. So you have the wonderful work by Prachi Deshpande on Maharashtrian historians like Sardesai and Rajwade. You have Dipesh Chakravarti's recent book on Jadunath Sarkar and the Indian History Congress, and the idea of the emergence of certain protocols of history writing, and which in some sense also represent a succumbing of the native mind to forms of writing which actually arise from other spaces, and a setting aside of the historical imagination, which is much larger. So, for example, the idea of periodization, ancient, medieval, modern, the idea of territory, the idea of writing the history of something called Bengal, right? Leaving out large swathes of Southeast Asia, which were part of that larger geography, or writing about a space called India, right? From Kashmir to Kanyakumari, rather than thinking about it as Brudel did, as I pointed out earlier. All of those become the markers of writing a history, and the archive then becomes limited to thinking with this kind of time and space. So how do we move beyond the historical imagination, a historical discipline, and the idea of time and space that is embedded in the colonial archive? How do we disrupt these notions of time and space? How do we move beyond that tired triad of pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial, as if the colonial was the hinge on which our societies worked? That in some sense, this was the hugely determining influence on or the only determining influence on our lives, imaginations, and our social and political processes. How do we think with the idea of the para-colonial, of a life lived beside colonialism, the continuation of other imagination, the continuation of other movements, other histories, and so on? So that is the enterprise that I am trying to work with right now, where how do we engage with indigenous imaginations of time and space while we write history of something called the colonial period? And for me, the most important figure in this rethinking has been Kesari Balakrishna Pilla, whose writings I've been engaging with for over a decade right now, a literary critic and historian, who thought with vast swathes of time and space. He was the person who made Malayalam literature what it is right now, hugely responsive to literary movements happening all over the world. In the 1930s, Balakrishna Pillai marks a departure from an engagement with English literature, and he says Malayali should be reading more European literature, Asian literature, and single-handedly engages in translations in his journal from French, from Scandinavian. Ibsen makes his appearance in Malayalam literature, and similarly begins to write historical works as well, which have not been engaged with as seriously as his literary work. And if one thinks about the 10 odd volumes of Balakrishna Pillai's work, the 4 to 5 volumes of his historical writings, it still remains a tragedy that people have not engaged with it seriously enough. Two questions come to us out of Balakrishna Pillai's work, of his oeuvre over a period of over 30 years, and which will allow us to question and allow us to move beyond some of the questions that we've been discussing here about the colonial archive. The first question is the question of time, right? And here, let's keep in mind this triad, the tired triad, as I call it, of pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial. So when he begins to write the history of Kerala and is engaging with the Parashurama myth, you know the Parashurama myth, that Kerala is recovered by Parashurama throwing his axe into the ocean as an expiation for his sin of killing 21 generations of Kshatriyas. The ocean retreats, the land comes into existence, and that's how Kerala is created. And there are multiple controversies about the land being given to Brahmins and so on, but we won't go into that here. So he connects the Parashurama myth to flood myths, right, which are the biblical myth of the flood and a huge geography extending all the way from China to the Middle East, where notions and ideas of the flood have been central to the formation of societies, central to the formation of historical periodizations, and central to the idea of origins of spaces themselves. So he asks a question, which is a question that haunts me, because it is a question that requires us to move beyond the abbreviated time of modernity that has been given to us by colonialism. We think with 300 years. What Balakrishna Pillai asked is, how far back does one have to go to write a history of the present? This is a profound question. How far back do we have to go in order to write a history of the present? And some of us would say, I mean, if you think about the kind of trivial debates that characterize history writing in India, where the idea of modern history, the idea of contemporary history, the idea of pre-modern history, and we all work with these very, very, very abbreviated notions of time, where to write a history of the present, to go back 50 is good, 50 years is good, to go back 100 years is adventurous, to go back 1,000 years is seen as, akin to smoking dope, for example. So this question of how far back does one have to go to write a history of the present raises the question of how to move beyond the colonial archive in a substantial sense, right? The second question that Balakrishna Pillai raises is that of a truly decentered history, which is, again, to go back to the Brudelian formulation, where he asks, how do we write a history that is not written under the shadow of the colonial notion of space and time, or of the nation state's notion of space and time? The idea of Bharatvarsha, Kashmir to Kanyakumari kind of idea, which characterizes the nationalist elite, regardless of whether on the left or the right or the center. And how do we actually engage the decolonial notion of space and time? So when he writes his essays on the history of Kerala, he begins with the Roman Empire. So the first question, how far back do we have to go to write a history of the present? It depends upon what you're writing about. So why does he begin with the Roman Empire? He begins with the Roman Empire because of the millennium-long engagement, as we know, with the excavations that are going on right now in Patna, right? The millennium-long engagement with the Roman Empire, where Kerala, in some sense, was connected integrally, much more with the Roman Empire than with Delhi or with Bengal or with places in Gujarat and so on, at various points in its existence and for long periods in its existence. And he begins with the Roman Empire because the wars between Rome and Carthage, the tribute that Carthage paid to Rome in pepper, the pepper came from Kerala, right? So Pliny, Strabo, all the Roman writers actually mention Kerala as a place where the wealth of Rome is being drawn in and sunk in to the space. It's a kind of drain of wealth in a reverse direction. So he asked the question. It's a question that's a resonant question. It's a question that ought to condition our post-colonial and our decolonial historical imagination. He asked the question, by beginning a history of Kerala with Rome, is Rome a chapter in the history of Kerala, or is Kerala a chapter in the history of Rome, right? This is a profound question that allows a moving beyond the colonized imagination, where we are merely a chapter in a history of European expansion. What Pillai forces us to ask is the question, is Rome a chapter in the history of Kerala? This requires us to move beyond the colonial archive and to think more substantially with notions of space and time. And I stop there. Thank you so much for being a patient audience.
Thank you very much, sir. So here ends an exciting lecture, and Professor Dilip Menon was literally going beyond and beyond colonial archives, and he was decolonizing the colonial archival praxis. Thank you very much, sir. And the floor is open for discussion, and you can type in your queries in the chat box, and I'll read it out for Professor Dilip. And yes, there is already a flood of questions in the chat box, and let me begin with my own question. Sir, is it audible? Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible. Please go ahead.
Okay, I have two questions. The first one is, there is an agency, mostly an elite or dominant group, and they are the one who constructed colonial archives and even many of the sources. For example, the higher caste Kayasthas and Baniyas and Bengali Brahmins, they were together called as three Hindus, and they were the one who translated the 18th century records. So there is a subjectivity. So my question is, how can we tackle the subjectivity in archival documents and sources per se? How can we perceive this in the context of colonial Kerala? And again, how far oral sources and folklore and literature can be used to overcome this subjectivity? This is the first question, sir.
Okay. No, this is an important question, and I think I've actually been speaking a bit about this because for most of us, like you, me, those of us who work on the history of Kerala, we know that we hit a limit when we work with the colonial archives, when we want to deal with the imaginations and the lives of subalterns. So if you think about, for example, Shiva's work, right? Shiva's work on Smartha Vicharam, right? About Nambudiri women and the ways in which Nambudiri patriarchy controlled the sexuality of Nambudiri women. You can't immediately go to the colonial archive and find records of the relations between men and women, as also the idea of the sexual freedom that women may have had in relation to their ordering their liaisons with men. We can't get that out of the colonial archive. We have to move to another set of sources, a set of sources which are far more intimate, a set of sources which are in some sense far more contained within communities. Again, when I began first working on the Theyyam, my attempt was to try and think about notions of space, time, and justice that were inherent in the practices of Malayan tribals and Vannan washermen, who kind of created a tradition of deifying local untouchable and lower caste victims of injustice, deifying them, and these performances were held in the presence of upper castes, allowing a critique of upper caste practices, of caste practices, of hierarchy, of inegalitarianism. Again, one had to move beside the colonial archive. Right? So you could think about multiple issues like this, and also one is beginning to think not only about the obvious, right? It's not only about the lives of women, the lives of untouchables and lower castes, the lives of tribal groups, where we need to think about oral history, we need to think about documents and texts and performances, right? Performances we don't survive beyond.
Sorry?
Embodied in speech, which are embodied in, yeah, sorry, can you hear me?
Can
Hello?
you, oh, okay, sir. You can carry on, sir.
We lost you for a
You can hear
second.
me?
You're back.
Yes, sir,
Yes.
we can
Yeah,
hear
sorry,
you.
I
You
mean,
can carry on, sir.
okay, no, I don't think you lost out on something hugely important and profound in that second, or indeed. No, but the thing is that if one thinks about not only these manifest textual evidences, now take, for example, the fact of the wonderful work being done by younger Malayali scholars with regard to Malayalam films, right? With regard to how a mise-en-scene is presented, for example, right? So if you think about a lot of the films of the 1980s, it's largely Hindu Taravadas. What people eat in a film is usually vegetarian food. There is the Velaka. There are multiple signs of the fractures that exist within society, the existence of a dominant caste imagination. We could also think about everyday phrases that are being used. So if you think about a film like Kammattipadam, for example, which actually brought into Malayalam cinema an entire new space of life that was absent earlier, people who looked different, right? From the standard fair male hero and the female heroine. So what we need to do is to think with not only the tangible, the search for the subaltern, but also to search for those attitudes of heterosexuality, attitudes of racism and casteism, attitudes that govern our imaginations, but which we don't recognize. They come without saying, therefore they go without saying. So in that sense, the colonial archive, or indeed, we have to generate another archive, an archive of gestures, an archive of expressions, an archive of visuality, right? We have to look at photographs, we have to look at cinema, we have to listen to music, even think about phrases that are so part of Malayalam vocabulary, like Chetti Nadaka, right? Which is seen as moving in style, which goes back to a very denigratory reference to the upstart Irava, right, of the early 20th century, a man who used to chettu, cut toddy palms. And now that has become Chetti Nadaka is basically saying, why are you being an upstart? That phrase has segued into an idea of style right now. So what we have to do is to move beyond the archive in fundamental ways where we are sensitive to registers of speech and what we see, right? Even in a film, that Kammattipadam, the first thing that people noticed was all the characters were dark-skinned, right? As opposed to the fair-skinned and evergreen Mohanlal and Mammootty, right, with their wigs. They're also almost always have hair on their head. So I think these kinds of questions require us to think about, it's the question that will determine the source. If you are to retain or understand the histories of inegalitarianism, hierarchy, and contempt in Kerala, we have to move to another set of sources altogether. But I'll stop there.
Yes, sir. That is a perfect reply. And sir, I think you have already answered my second question. So we are moving to the next question from the chat box. This is asked by Gigi KV. She's asking, sir, how can we trace the history of the marginalized people as no record is available about them in any literature and in archives? For example, the history of the migration or exodus of Cherumas and Pulayas to the Southeast Asian countries.
Okay, actually, there are two questions here. I mean, how do we, I think part of this I've answered in response to your question as well, recovering the history of marginalized people. And if you think about two novels that have come, or two novelists, when you think about Johnny Miranda's novel, you think about the Narayanan's Kochereti, there is a way in which these novels are trying to capture the traces of forms of language and forms of life, which in some sense are present in our midst. But for us, they seem to occupy another space. It's what the anthropologists called a denial of coevalness, that there are certain people who live at the same time as us, but they seem to belong to another time. And so in Malayalam literature, you're seeing a lot of these voices which are bringing out these histories of different spaces and so on. Now, how do we engage with these histories? How do we engage with the history, for example, of the connections between Cheramas and Pulayas and Indian oceanic slavery? Right? And Grace Mariam Raju at Jamia Millia Islamia is now doing work on the presence of these Kapiri Muttappan, right? The idea of the black slave who has come to be deified in Cochin, right? And who draws together a history of slavery across the Indian Ocean, exceeding the time space of the Indian nation, or exceeding indeed the space of Kerala. So the migration of Cheramas and Pulayas, one can actually track it in the colonial archive. And this is possible because if you look at the reports on migration, you can find out the numbers of Cheramas and Pulayas who are going to work in the plantations of Sri Lanka, going to work in the plantations in Southeast Asia and so on. And there are these figures which I've had a look at, and this you can get from the archives. But to actually ask oneself, so what happens to these people, right? I mean, you can trace numbers. You can say, well, 30,000 Pulayas in such and such a year, 40,000 Pulayas in such and such a year. You can say during the Depression, Great Depression of the 1930s, these numbers declined. But this is mere empirical stuff. I mean, what do you do with this? You need to know names, you need to know the texture of their lives. And here, if you go to the India Office Library, there are these pamphlets that are present, written by Pulayas and Cheramas who've gone to work in places like Basra, places like Penang, who write pamphlets when they come back. Because one of the things about social mobility is literacy, is producing an account of your life. So there are these brief pamphlets which tell about lives. There are poems recording sea voyages. There's a whole set of tracts. I mean, one can't say they run into the thousands. They certainly run into the 50s and the hundreds. And this is something, again, that has not been worked upon. I made a brief mention of this in an article of mine a long time ago, but we can track this, the migration of Cheramas and Pulayas and their effect. The other thing that is really important, which comes up, is when we try and think beyond Kerala, because what we are condemned to in India is that Malayalis work on a space called Kerala, Bengalis work on a space called Bengal, Maharashtrians work on a space called Maharashtra, and there are these hugely circulating histories which we are not aware of, right? And that, and when we think about Cheramas and Pulayas, a large number of Cheramas and Pulayas who go to work in Sri Lanka, for example, are hugely influenced by the defense of Hinduism that is made in Vatikota, for example, by Brahmins against the attacks of Christian missionaries. And they carry this history of these public debates back into Kerala. So when you read Samuel Mattee's Native Life in Travancore, he talks about the number of public spaces that are coming up, which are debate halls. These debate halls are being funded by returning Cheramas and Pulayas, who set up these spaces within which they can have these conversations about equality, about Hinduism, about engagement with Christian missionaries. And part of the work that I did on Chattambi Swamigal engaged with some of this. And so what we need to do is to have a larger map. Just as Balakrishna Pilla begins his history of Kerala with the Roman Empire, similarly, when we think about these migratory populations like Cheramas and Pulayas, not the Nambudiris who stayed in their mana, right? Who were born there, died there, never left the place. We're talking about people who migrated, and we need to track their geographies, right? We need to move with them and to think about the geography they create through their peregrinations and the ideas that they generate. So it's not enough. It's not enough to say I'm a historian of Kerala and I shall look only at Malayalam sources. I say follow the Cheraman and the Pulayan into Basra, into Penang, into Colombo. And that's when you will have a true history. And there will be sources that will become available once you move beyond the confines of that narrow strip of land that Parashurama created for us.
So here is an interesting question. This is from Nitin A, MPhil student, SSU Escalade. He's asking, I have come across an incident where a Muslim was appointed as record keeper by Jacob Ryder, who was a Gaznipur judge in 1795. But the identity of Muslim is always been under question, and it is marginalized, subaltern, and excluded. But how can we perceive this particular event? What is the criteria of record keeping and translation as well? Caste or skill?
Yeah, actually, this is an interesting question, you see, because when one thinks about the idea of colonial knowledge or knowledge produced under colonialism, very often, and this is something that there's been a lot of work done over the last 20 or 30 years about the idea of the native informant, right? That colonial officials tended to collaborate with indigenous intellectuals, and that is how knowledge was created, right? And when one thinks about, I mean, I don't know about this particular instance where the Muslim is appointed a record keeper, but you could think about Walker of Boland, whom I talked about earlier. He's very careful in listing the number of people who he was in conversation with, the names of the Nayars and Iravas. When you think about Van Reed's Hortus Malabaricus Indicus, which is the first, probably a historical record of biodiversity, he records the Irava who actually assisted him. So throughout this enterprise of the gathering of information, there are these forgotten figures. And what is interesting here is that these are not figures that one traditionally assumes to be intellectuals, right? We tend to assume that knowledge was in the hands of the Brahmin, right? And this is something that we take for granted, right? That if you're talking about the traditional intellectual leaders and the traditional intellectual repositories of knowledge, we tend to assume that they would be Nayars and Nambudris, but this was not true. Because very often, as you can see when you go to England and you work with the Missionary Society archives, most Nayars and Nambudris treated Christian missionaries with contempt and would have nothing to do with them, right? And they would make fun of them. So, for example, there are these long, sad notebooks written by missionaries working in Travancore that they would go to a Nayar and want to tell him about Jesus. And he'd say, well, Jesus died on the cross. Look at my Krishna. He had 1,008 women, wives, and he enjoyed himself with them and so on. So there was an engagement of a theological enterprise with great triviality and contempt. So very often colonial engagement had to happen with those who would engage with them. And a lot of them were very traditional intellectuals as well. The other thing is that when you look at people like Chattambi Swamigal and the geography that he traverses, Chattambi Swamigal is a poor Nayar. He becomes a guru of the Nayars. But in the course of his travels, he's engaging with Irava Vaidyans, right? He's engaging, staying at the home of Iravas. When Srinarayana Guru becomes a prominent figure, prior to that, you have the Jnana Prajagara Sabha in Travancore, which includes a royal family, it includes Iravas, and it includes people of other castes as well. So these are the histories we have to recover. Because very often we have the sense of a binary, right, of a society, caste society that was so rigid. And we also, as a result of that, assume that the knowledge was in the possession of Nayars and Nambudris alone, and nothing could be further from the truth, right? The fact that Chattambi Swamigal could become a guru of the Nayars was because of his engagement with the whole tradition of Irava knowledge that goes all the way back to the 17th century and Van Reed's engagement with the Irava intellectuals in the writing on biodiversity. Right? So I think we need to pick up these individuals, this Muslim record keeper, Kallingal Koru, who Walker of Boland talks about, the Irava who was the correspondent of Van Reed, and through them, we shall arrive at a truer intellectual and social history of Kerala than the one that we have, which is really that of a top-down hierarchical society in which knowledge just goes down. Right? And I think there's a much more dispersed sense of knowledge that we need to work with.
We are moving to the next question. This is from Agil AR, PhD candidate, Jawaharlal Nehru University. To what extent the archives, even if we understand the prejudices of them, will be able to record or address emotions of non-elite subjects? And how can we understand or trace this from the past, where oral sources are non-existent?
Right. I mean, the thing is that, I don't know. I mean, we can't be theological about this, right? Like when you travel abroad in hotels, you go to a hotel and next to your bedside, there's the Bible, the Gideon's Bible, right? And it says, when in trouble, read this verse. If you are having a marital crisis, read this verse. We can't treat the colonial archives like this. So if you want to work on a history of emotions, you don't ask, okay, now what do I do in the colonial archives that will give me a history of emotions? You have to ask yourself, if this is your question, right, where do your sources lie? It could lie in song, it could lie in fiction, it could lie in the affective relation of people with photographs, it could lie in paintings, it could lie in music, right? So when you think about the history of emotions in Kerala, Swati Thirunal would be one person to go to, Pulayapata would be another place to go to, right? And so on and so forth. So I think the idea of moving beyond the colonial archive is not to say that the colonial archive is superfluous, right? Which is why I began with the idea of the danger to our very lives and democracy that is being posed to us by the Hindu authoritarian regime, which is why a record of what is in the archive is important for us. But the other historical questions that we're asking, like histories of emotions, histories of subaltern, we probably need to move beyond the archive, right? And to engage with what is before us, beside us, what we hear, what we see, what we experience, right? And even a film like, if you think about Malayalam film has begun to capture the texture of the intangible in ways that cinema nowhere else in India has. So whether you're talking about The Taste of Biryani, right? You know the film that I'm referring to here with Fahad Fasil, yeah? To forms of life like in Kammati Padam, or to the wonderful film Kumbalangi Nights, which talks about a particular community and the idea that a family is constituted through multiple relationships not governed by blood, right? A family is comprised of people who come to live together, right? So a lot of these ideas that we take for granted in our social sciences of, Kudumbam enna amma achen makkala, right? And I remember even going back to, my mother used to tell me the story. I mean, I'm from Palakkad. My mother comes from a matrilineal family. So my grandmother stayed with her brother and sisters and the children. And so my mother tells me the story of my uncle way back in the 40s reading from a text, Kudumam enna bharya makkal, and my grandmother gives him a tight slap and says, Kudumam enna sahodarivarum kunjangalam. It's not like Bhartav and Bharya. It's not a nuclear family. So we also have a changing landscape of affect, changing landscape of emotions that characterizes Kerala across communities, because even matrilineal is not something that only Nayars practiced. Muslims practiced it, Iravas practiced it. And this creates a whole different landscape. And this is something that Mahmood Kuria is working on right now, a wonderful work that looks at Indian Ocean matrilineal, right, in an arc that stretches all the way from the Hadramaut region in Yemen through to Southeast Asia. And Kerala is a part of this as well, where Muslim matrilineal is also governed by the fact of the passage of the scholars, merchants, and political figures across this vast swathe from Yemen through to Southeast Asia, right? Men who would marry locally and then would move on, right? And the women would stay with the families, have their children, and so on. So Kerala has multiple histories which open themselves to us so long as we don't work with the map of Kerala, which is given to us in 1956. November 1st, 1956 was the closing of the Malayali mind, right? Where we saw Travancore, Kochi, and Malabar as Kerala, rather than the Indian Ocean, rather than the Coromandel coast in Southeast Asia, and so on.
Sir, this is like Dr. Tanu Parashar, Jesus and Mary College, University of Delhi. She is trying to add some points. I would like to add one more point here, thought-provoking section, sir. The idea of subordination by colonial powers were practiced through the census officers or officials who used to call local people in Bengal to speak about their dreams, and the officers were able to understand the extent of impact of their rule on them. It was just a window into the thinking of the locals about the British rule.
This is interesting for me. I mean, I see this more as a comment that adds to my knowledge than a question. I hadn't known about the census addressing the dreams of people that they were actually interviewing, and I'd be interested if you could email me about this and carry on a conversation. My email is dil1962@yahoo.com. Thank you so much for this reference.
The next question is from Satyajit. How do you rely on the factuality of archival records by the colonial instruments? Since interpretation is impersonal, doesn't corroboration with evidence play a vital role?
Yes, I mean, I think this is a question more about historical practice and the protocols of historical practice, the idea of corroboration. And I'm not sure what is meant by impersonal here. Is it relating back to the question of the objectivity of the historian and so on, which are questions I think we possibly need to engage with a greater degree of skepticism, because all good history is subjective history. So otherwise, we would not have the emergence of Dalit history, feminist history, Black history, where people have asked the question, where are we in these histories that we study, right? So certainly the archive exists as a repository, but whether it can be used for corroboration is another set of questions, because if you think about what Ranajit Guha, whom I referred to earlier, his writings I referred to earlier, Ranajit Guha and others, a whole host of writings on the archives have alerted us to the fact that the archive is possibly nothing more than the prejudices, the sum of the prejudices of those who write it. So it's not as if you turn to the archives for something that is clinching evidence. Right? The archive itself needs to be the subject of inquiry to be corroborated with what lies outside the archive. So that would be my brief response. I hope I've answered the question.
The next question.
Excuse me?
Yes, you can carry on.
Yes,
You can carry on.
yeah, I just needed to add on. It was a wonderful lecture. Thanks for the good lecture. So I was just thinking, like, our history has been written since the Sangam era. They say, like, since 2,300 years, and from the initial period when we talk about the Maurya dynasty, where Megasthenes talks about Chandragupta Maurya, or Zhuang Zong talks about the Indian Buddhist culture, and also when we look down the stairs till the modern period, hasn't it been an amalgamation of all the historical studies that have been done, like how secular it is, our history, not to absorb everything that is being told at us, but isn't history like going into the society as such and looking at how evolved we are and trying to retrace the steps back, and corroborating with literary sources as well?
Okay, I mean, I think you've asked a whole set of questions there.
I'm sorry for that.
No. I mean, this is not to, so I'm just trying to think through that. I mean, I think I can probably reduce it to two questions for reasons of convenience. One is the idea of a record of history that has come to us over a very long period, and it's a process of accumulation, of accruing of history, so that we knew less then, we know more now, right? There's that idea. Then you brought in the idea of, so that's the idea of progress in the writing of history and of filling in the gaps, filling in the blanks and so on. Then you briefly mentioned secularism, but that I'm not sure how that configures in the argument, but maybe we'll talk about that separately. Now, one of the things that we need to understand is that it's not as if to understand the writing of history as if it were a kind of linear progress towards perfection, that at some point we'll have a history that is complete, right? Like a jigsaw puzzle. You painfully put in all these pieces and the picture emerges. I don't think we can think about it like that, because each age is characterized by its own ignorance, by its own prejudices, its own contingencies, its own understanding of what history is, of what humans want, right? So that, for example, the only persistent fact in Indian history has been the inegalitarianism of caste, that some are less human than others. That is something that has stayed with us, but a lot else has changed, right?
You know, so
And
something comes to my mind regarding a quote by Churchill. Like, history is written by the victors, by the winners. Like, you just see 50% of what is being actually, what has actually happened, and the one who surpasses that and survives, right, is part of the, like, Babarnama or Akbarnama and stuff like that. So it's prejudiced, like you said. It is really
yeah,
prejudiced.
and I agree. I agree that, there are two things. I mean, it's rather unfortunate that you should choose Winston Churchill. It's like quoting Hitler to prove your argument. A genocidal character like Churchill, but I mean, history is written by victors. That is true. I'm not sure why you brought in Babur and Akbar into this, unless you want to say that they produce an idea of, no, but let's not get into that. The others who are waiting with questions. But I think, we need to set aside this idea of Hindu and Muslim. And I mean, I think this doesn't really work for the times that we are talking about. But the important thing is that this idea of progress and the idea that we shall arrive at perfect histories is an idea that we need to jettison. History will always be a contentious issue, right? So when you think about the fact that when you were at school, or even when I was at school, Ambedkar was taught to us as the architect of the Indian Constitution. He was not taught to us as the foremost philosopher of equality in India. Somebody who argued that the one thing that India lacks is fraternity, that Indians don't know how to give each other respect. We can legislate equality, you can legislate liberty, but you cannot legislate treating somebody with respect, right? He was the foremost philosopher of that. He tried to argue for that in the Constitution. About secularism, again, I mean, I think you brought in secularism briefly. I think the desire to write a secular history, which is to say that not writing history as a Hindu period, a Muslim period, and strangely enough, a British rather than a Christian period, right? These are some of the illusions produced by colonialism. We have to ask ourselves that the question that when we write histories, what is it that we are striving to achieve, right? We are striving to achieve a society of justice, of compassion, of equality, and where everybody's dignity is taken, is respected, right? That's the society we try to achieve. And we try and write histories towards that end, which create the possibilities for everyone, regardless of whether they are subaltern or elite, to imagine a place for themselves in that history, right? An equal place for themselves in that history. Now, that is a dream that is vitiated, right? That is reduced, both by a writing of what we call communal history, where we think about Hindu casteist histories or histories that argue that the Muslims were invaders, or histories that argue that that Muslims were were absolutely and only beneficial to India, or that British colonialism was the best thing that happened to India. There are multiple ways of writing that, writing these histories. So we, instead of moving towards these extremes, it's to ask ourselves, in the span of history, right, from ancient India to the present, what are the tendencies that have promoted forms of life that have guaranteed equality between people, that have generated a compassion for the underdog, which have generated a compassion for the environment, and so on and so forth. So when we think with that, we shall find that these distinctions of Hindu, Muslim, and Christian, of Brahmin and untouchable, possibly are not the only categories that we should be working with, right? That there have been relations to the environment, relations to the self, and relations of the self to a cosmic idea of equality that have emerged from multiple sources. It has come from Kabir, it has come from Christian missionaries, it has come from Ayangali, and so on and so forth, right? So we have to have a thematic engagement with history rather than a jigsaw puzzle engagement with history, where at some point in our life, we can shut the box and put it away, right?
Very, very true. Very true. Thank you.
Debate will always be with us. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Satyajit, for coming forward and explaining your question in detail. So next question, we are moving to the next question. This is from Givargis AM. He's asking, you describe the data repositories in terms of kilometer and marathon scales, but with the advent and hegemony of the digital regime, every transaction, event, and utterance, even the everyday, is archived. Cell phone archives would approximate infinity. The transformation of data archive to the scale of big data has also made data sorting and data inferences algorithmic. How historical imagination and social science theory kept pace with this?
Yes, I mean, this whole idea of digital humanities has created a space for us to engage beyond the merely
Sorry, Professor Dilip Menon will be back in few minutes. Please hold on for a few minutes. There is a connectivity issue.
Hello, can you
Yes,
hear
sir.
me?
You were muted for a few seconds. You can carry on, sir.
Yeah, again, I mean, I think there's something happening here. It's probably I'm talking too much, which is why the warning from Google. No, so the question really is, how do we engage with the digital humanities? How do we engage with big data? How do we engage with, forms like WhatsApp messages, Facebook posts, what are seen as ephemeral, right? But which are part of the texture of everyday life and which also reflect many of the aspirations and prejudices that condition our everyday existence, right? For those of us who are on Facebook and WhatsApp, WhatsApp is a constant source of irritation, which is why we have the phrase WhatsApp University, which is why we withdraw from relatives groups, for example, because it gets too much, the kind of prejudices that circulate in those spaces. But to think about how are we to engage with this space, let's go back a few years to the Arab Spring, right? So 2011, you have that wave of movements all the way Tunis, Egypt, and so on and so forth, bring down dictators. A lot of the mobilization of people happened through WhatsApp messages, through social media, and that set into operation a historical consciousness where people felt that, look, this is the sign of the present. It's not, people are not writing letters to each other. The officials responding to the crisis are, responding on social media, responding on cell phones. How do we record this evidence? And so over the last 10 years or so, there's been an increasing engagement with what we initially saw as ephemeral and not lasting, transient social media messages. And I think the creation of digital archives is becoming more and more sophisticated. It's becoming more and more sophisticated for the historian who wants to retain the traces of everyday life, of everyday oppositions, and of everyday connections. But you're also worried about what Shoshana Zuboff has called surveillance capitalism, that what we are putting out there in a voluntary giving up of our privacy. We are putting out data out there on WhatsApp and on Facebook, which are being deployed as big data in order to determine the preferences of people, influence the ways in which we act. We saw this during the elections in America. We saw those of you who've seen the wonderful film on Cambridge Analytica, which came out on Netflix. The ways in which big data is marshaled, not only to understand consumer preferences, but also to dictate not only the personal choices of people, but the political prejudices of people in order to aggravate. So the rise of the right wing, whether it's in Europe, right wing and fascist force, or whether in Europe and America, is also part of this aggregation of big data that is happening and of targeted influencing. So this is something that the social sciences will have to take into account, where we earlier worked with radio broadcasts, leaflets, newspaper articles, and so on, which were seen as influencing people. We have to cast our net much wider and to think with what we are using, which is why in response to one of the earlier questions, I said that we have to be sentient beings in the sense of seeing every action that we perform, every word that we utter, every word that or phrase that we put out there, that this is entering a vast network, a web of knowledge of which we are a part. right? And to be aware of this is also to be aware of the ways in which there is that invisible movement that is happening in the world. It's like watching a flock of birds in the sky that swirl and swoop as if governed by some cosmic consciousness. It's a similar thing that is happening when you think about the large-scale reactions that are happening, some of which are engineered. When you think about lynch mobs in India, or when you think about communal violence in India, which is triggered by WhatsApp messages, and WhatsApp retorts to this by saying you can't forward a message more than 5 times, as if this puts an end to the problem. But there's that level where there is a conscious and present thing that you can see with your eyes, but there is also something that is happening in the aggregation of mass data, which we probably need to become more aware of. And these distinctions of social sciences and sciences and all of this make little sense if you're a public intellectual and if you're engaged as a human being, that there is much more need to be aware of these media that we are willy-nilly part of, unconsciously part of, involuntarily part of, and to engage with it with a degree of knowledge that is required of us as responsible individuals and citizens. You can't say, well, I'm over 50 now, I can't do this anymore. Or, oh, I need to read too much. I read the history of Kerala. I don't read Shoshana Zuboff's Surveillance Capitalism. There isn't the luxury of withdrawal. Right? The world is in us right now. And we have to realize that. To give you a simple thing, a friend of mine, her husband died recently, and immediately her Facebook page was bombarded with insurance companies offering insurance, travel companies offering a leisure cruise, and so on. And the world was at her doorstep already, right? Creating her as a consumer of these multiple needs that are being generated. So I think the important thing is to be aware and to read far, far, far beyond your region, far beyond your discipline, in order to understand what it is to be a human in the present day world. We can't afford to be ignorant, because that ignorance is what is causing the rise of these dictatorships all around us.
So next question is from Tapati Guha Takurta, and I would like to invite Professor Tapati to come forward and ask a question. We are really excited to hear it from you, ma'am. Professor Tapati, are you there? Hello?
She may have left. I saw her briefly. I could see her face listening in. Maybe she's left.
She wanted to ask the question herself, but I don't think she's there. She call has dropped.
No, we could probably move on to the next question then.
Meenu, I'll give her a call. You move on to the next question.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Okay. This question is from Sanu PC, research scholar, SSUS Kaladi. The existing archival documents are official in nature and do not reflect the voices of the common man. How then could archival records be strategically employed to retrieve these histories?
Actually, we've answered this question before. I mean, I've answered this question before.
Yes, sir. You have answered the same question at the outset.
Yeah. If I could just add briefly on to this, I mean, one of the things that we must remember is that we tend to think about the archive as a kind of museum, right? As a mausoleum of documents. One of the interesting things really is the fact of how archives are a part of everyday life when it comes to settling claims about property, settling claims on land. So if you think about Bihar, for example, where there are multiple disputes happening over possession of land, people are decreed dead, people have their land taken away, the archives are at the heart of social relations in the countryside. So I think in different situations, archives have a different place. If you think about the archives in the British Museum, very often you do find that the archive leaps out into society when a claim comes which has to be backed up historically. So I think those connections between the archives and everyday life are something that we need to think about. And certainly there is much that isn't there in the archive that we need to look elsewhere, but that we've already talked about.
Dr. Tapati had to leave. She will contact you personally.
No, that's fine. I'll email her. She's an old friend. That's not a problem.
You can continue.
Yes, this question is from Parvati Sudan. Thank you for the interesting thoughts, and I like to know about the terrestrial imagination, which makes me think about the land and ocean. Is this bipolar way of looking at the history lack the panoramic view? Yes, sir, you spoke about the colonial archive, which is a production of anxieties of colonial rulers themselves. But is this anxieties a kind of reflection of the elite class in the society?
Well, the answer to the second question is yes. That the archive reflects not only the anxieties of the colonial rulers, but it also, in some sense, shapes the anxieties of the elite class in society. So if the colonial administration creates a geography of India that stretches from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, the elite class who are to be the inheritors of the colonial territory, right? In that sense, when the Raj becomes the India, when the British Raj is supplanted by an Indian government, these anxieties begin to merge, right? So the anxieties of the Indian elite class and the anxieties of the colonial class become one and the same after a period of time. And this you see in debates about development, for example, the contempt towards subaltern groups whose lives are seen as dispensable, and so on and so forth. So that's a question that's fairly straightforward. When I spoke about the terrestrial and the maritime imagination, it was not to kind of say, well, we need to supplant one by the other, that we've had a terrestrial imagination so far, so hey, let's move to the oceanic imagination. What I was suggesting is that, look, we've too long worked with only a terrestrial imagination. We need to bring these imaginations together. We need to understand that India is open to the ocean, right? And the history of southern India has been the history of oceanic influences just as much as the history of northern India has been the history of the large-scale land migrations of people, whether of political forces and so on and so forth. But how do we bring these imaginations together? That is the crucial question that we need to think about. And so far, historians if you think about histories of modern Kerala tend to study Kerala as if it's Hungary, in the sense that there is no sea present. It's always the history of temples, it's a history of land, it's a history of land relation, Janmi, Kanakaran, Patakaran, and somehow the history of the ocean gets written out. And what you have is a Hindu imagination of Kerala, where the Muslims are absent as traders, the Christians are absent as traders and those who engage with commerce, and you can multiply the examples, right? So when you had Amitav Ghosh write that essay in Subaltern Studies a long time back, The Slave of AH, where he's talking about a Nair slave girl who gets married to a Jewish merchant, and suddenly you have a history of Kerala which is part of the ocean, a history of slavery, a history of commerce, a history of a much wider geography than that of that narrow strip of land. And so it's to bring together these histories, and I spoke about this also when we spoke about Charamas and Pulayas and so on, the question regarding the Charamas and Pulayas. So I think it's not about one or the other, it's about studying it together and depending upon what one's theme is.
There is a very interesting question from Jayaji Nair. Not just the marginalized people, how much do you think the life of the upper caste or people of privilege is present or not present in the colonial archives?
It's a very interesting question. The answer is that, since I worked through the paradigm of subaltern studies, I was speaking about marginalized people, but vast swathes of history, vast swathes of people are excluded from the colonial archive because it's like it's only when there is a problem of some kind do people begin to figure in the archive and the state notices them. There are a lot of people who are invisible to the state. So earlier we had a question about emotions, for example, right? So if you were to write an emotional history of Kerala, looking for the history of emotions of the upper caste or untouchables, all lower castes, Muslims, or Christians, it'd be difficult to find it within the colonial archives. One would have to look elsewhere. So the archives excludes a lot, right? And it's not only governed by class and by caste and so on, it's a thematic issue as well. Whereas if you were a peasant who were, whether you're Veluthambi Dalava rising in revolt against the colonial officers, or you're a Pulaya or Charama rising in revolt, you would figure in the archive because you're a source of trouble, right? But a lot of other histories wouldn't figure regardless. Yes.
Parvati Sudan is coming up with her second question. And another query is that the idea of the archive as a sort of strategic information, is it applicable to the official documents produced by the princely states?
This is a very interesting question because, see, one way to think about modern Indian history is that when we think about modern Indian history, it's really modern India minus 533 princely states. Really, that's how we study it. Of course, in histories of certain states are written about more than the others. So we know a lot about Travancore, Mysore, Baroda, some states in Rajasthan, but a large number of princely states, probably more than 75% of the princely states, don't make it into our study of a modern India, right? Unless they were progressive states or they were threats. So Travancore, Mysore, Baroda figure as progressive states. Junagadh and Hyderabad are perceived as threats, and so on and so forth. So I think the question really here is that in the princely states, a lot of the princely states were not autonomous, right? They had British residents and so on. And they were also in many senses, if they weren't actually residents stationed in the princely states, they were in a degree of collaboration with the British government for purpose of law and order, revenue, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of strategic information, right? But on the other hand, in the princely states, if you think about Travancore, Kochi, Baroda, and so on, you also have a different engagement with notions such as science, for example. So if you look at the work of Savitri Preeta Nair, who did a PhD with Professor David Arnold at SOAS, she looks at what she calls the observatory zoo museum complex that comes up in the progressive states, in the progressive princely states. So in Mysore, Baroda, Travancore, for example, I mean, anyone who lives in Thiruvananthapuram knows that there is a zoo there and there's a museum there. And this is a replicable model across Baroda, Mysore, and so on and so forth. The idea was that while you had engagement with science, which is very practical, right, in the British colonial space, where it was questions of medicine, it was questions of dealing with plagues, epidemics, and so on. It was lunatic asylums, a whole set of issues like that. In these princely states, in the progressive princely state, there was an engagement with science that was, in some sense, over and above the strategic imperative, right, of controlling epidemics and so on. So if you think about Bangalore, why is Bangalore the seat of IT in India right now? There is a history of the princely state of Mysore's engagement with science, Divan Vishwesharaya, the work that Janaki Nair has done. So when Janaki Nair comes to speak in this series, perhaps we should ask her that question. So the princely states have a different engagement with science, with the notion of modernity, with the notion of knowledge. This Janaki has written about it, Savitri Preeta Nair has written about it, Indira Peterson has written about it. So I think there's a whole set of questions that are different from that of colonial India, but a whole set of questions, issues which are very similar as well, right? So there's the strategic element, there's also the element that is in excess, right, which is present in princely India.
This is not a question. Amil Varghese is trying to add some information. When you talked about Kristen Ver's work, The Paper Cadavers, the archives of dictatorship in Guatemala, it reminded me of a museum in Cambodia that's the Tulsang Genocide Museum that chronicles the Cambodian genocide under the Khmer Rouge regime. I think the pronunciation is correct.
Yeah. Under the Khmer Rouge. And this is an interesting parallel because what connects both Guatemala and Cambodia is the interference of the United States of America in states all over the world. right? In the period of the Cold War, that the prospects for democracy were stultified all over the world by American interference. And even though America has worked under the guise of instituting democracy, so in Iran, as you know, a democratically elected government is replaced by a monarch. So Mossadegh's government is removed in 1953, and the Shah of Iran is put in its place. So I think, yeah, but this is just a comment. I mean, what I'm saying is just a comment, and I leave it there. Yes, there are parallels that we could think about.
The next question is from Seema Mohammed. As a novice researcher engaging with the archives of a tribal community for the first time, I would like to understand what are some of the ways in which one engages with archives, and what are some of the aspects one needs to keep in mind while writing them about them and thereby representing them.
Seema, this is a big question, and there's a whole lot of work out there. You know the works of Nandini Sundar, Archana Prasad, Alpa Shah, and there's a whole lot of anthropological literature. There's also work done by my cousin Vinita Menon, whom I can see there, who's written on tribal populations in Kerala. So I think, I mean, I can't really give you a comprehensive answer to that question. If you were to email me, I could direct you to some literature that you might want to engage with. And possibly if you could tell me about your work, then I would know what exactly it is that you're looking for. So please do email me and we can carry on the conversation later.
The next question is from Srinivasa Rao. Compared to colonial state, the Indian state seems to be much more secretive and does not seem to believe that the archives is the best place where documents on governance could be kept. Why? In independent India, by the time the other is started reaching archives to write their history, the elite historian seems to dismiss the archives as an institution that may not be trusted. Are the elite historians confusing upcoming historians from the marginalized intentionally?
No, this is an important question. There's the whole theoretical question of how we are to see knowledge that is produced in the archives. It's an epistemological question. There is a strategic question, and as I said, you know, the archives are hugely important. If we are to hold our governments to account, right? If we are to change the way in which we are constituted as societies, we do need the information that is there in the archives, and it's not as if the archives have been exhausted. So the idea of critiquing the archives is not a conspiracy on the part of elite historians. It's just to alert us to some of the problems of treating the archives as the repository of truth, right, in any meaningful sense. Those of you who have read Thomas Piketty's new book, you know, Capital and Ideology, one of the things that he points out there is that the Indian government, now if you are to actually talk about inequality in India, you have to talk about inheritance in India, you have to talk about who has wealth, right? And who produces, you know, who pays the taxes or doesn't pay taxes. There's a lot of this information, which is basic stuff for understanding economic inequality in a society, is not available. Part of it is maybe because of the Indian state being secretive. Part of it is the inefficiency of the Indian state. Part of it is lethargy, right? We must factor in various things. One can't always work with a Manichaean idea of good and evil, that the Indian state somehow wants to keep information from us. Very often the Indian state is not capable. It doesn't have the wherewithal to generate that kind of information. The number of people who pay taxes in India is a fraction. I mean, it's under 10%. I mean, it's pathetic, right? You know, which is why we need to think about the idea of relating to the archives and the idea of information, you know, not only with a conspiratorial view in mind. I think the important thing here is that, yes, there is a lot of secretiveness, right? When you think about, let's say you're a historian who wants to work on the Northeast, wants to work on Manipur, Nagaland, places like that. You can go to the National Archives and no records are available. They're kept from you. They're treated as secret. You want to work on Kashmir, and you go to the National Archives of India, large numbers of records are unavailable to you because these are seen as governed by strategic concerns. But on the other hand, there is also the fact of, you know, like the National Sample Survey, the multiple series of informations which have been generated since independence, which some of which has fallen by the wayside under the present government. some of which has never been, some of the questions that you might want to ask, there isn't that kind of basis of information on which you can build an argument because the government has never done it. So I think we need to be slightly varied in our arguments. We can't work with any one argument about secrecy, keeping information from the people, and so on.
The next question is from Abhijit B. Can you reflect a bit more on what you mean by para-colonial? How can it be distinguished from post-colonial framework? I mean, is it similar to saying that we need to retrieve a history unpolluted by colonial effects? In connection with this, how can it be juxtaposed to the category of capitalist modernity?
Okay, again, a whole set of questions there. So let me take it up one by one. I mean, I don't think it is possible to retrieve a history that is unpolluted by colonial effect. Now, that is mere sentimentality. There is no space out there of authenticity, of autonomy that is waiting for us, and a true Indian experience that escaped colonialism and escaped much else. So I don't believe in that. When I talk about para-colonial, it's again like when the question relating to terrestrial and oceanic imagination. What I mean to say is that the paradigm of colonialism need not exhaust our historical imagination. When we think with a triad of pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial, there is a way in which we are unable to think about other processes that are happening. So for example, I mean, let's say you're a historian of music, right? And in what significant ways would the practice of music be different from pre-colonial India to colonial India to post-colonial India? The temporality of music might be very different from those political temporalities. Similarly with art, if you think about the fact that when you have Ravi Verma, for example, that Ravi Verma is very influenced by academic realism in France, right? And academic realism in France is influenced by whole histories of European art movements, iconography, and so on and so forth. So we're thinking about a space of painting which sits beside, it's not entirely independent of, entirely autonomous of the political time, but it also sits beside and exceeds that political time. So when I talk about para-colonial, I'm asking the question, how can we think about spaces, themes, which exceed the time of the colonial, right? Which exist at the time of the colonial, but exceed it. And that's a question that we have to ask if we are not to think with this abbreviated time of modernity that's given to us, right?
The next question is from Kunyani Sajiv. It's true that the traditional notions of historical imaginations have to change, but isn't it downplaying the whole idea of economic inequalities and underdevelopment that exists between nation states? And he is he's mentioning two books, Kenneth Pomeranz, The Great Divergence, and Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped by Africa.
No, I can't see that there is a question here, because I'm completely in agreement with what he says, that we have to change our traditional notions of historical imagination, by which I mean to study the history of nation states as if they were kind of autonomous entities, that to study the history of India is to study the history of Africa, is to study the history of Europe, right? That when we think about Kenneth Pomeranz's book, for example, The Great Divergence, he's actually talking about the multiple influences and circulation of histories that is happening in the space between China and Latin America, and at a particular point, how Europe begins to take a different path, right? Now, one might argue alongside Kenneth Pomeranz and also slightly in disagreement with him, that what Kenneth Pomeranz does not pay sufficient attention to are the genealogies of knowledge that are circulating, which are taken up by Europe, right, and developed to a certain extent. It's not that Europe had anything particular or peculiar to it, a greater rationality, a greater spirit of inquiry, that at a particular point, political and social formations managed to bring together a whole set of circulating knowledges coming from the Arab inheritance, the Arab carryover of the Greek inheritance to Europe, from knowledge from China and so on and so forth. So even to study the history of European capitalism, one has to bring in China, Latin America, and so on. So if you're interested, the volume that I edited for Oxford, which came out this year, called Capitalisms Towards a Global History, actually tries to look at the history of capitalism from the 10th century to the 18th century, that is prior to the Industrial Revolution. So it's actually asking the question that prior to the Industrial Revolution emerging in England or the industrialization of Europe, that much else needed to happen, and that we need to think about the circulation of histories, and that we can't be confined to thinking about entities like Europe and Asia and so on. Mexican silver was present in the Philippines, Mexican silver was present in China, silver coming in from the Spanish conquest of Mexico disrupts the Mughal economy, and so on and so forth. It's the whole world is connected, and which is why I think more and more people are beginning to think about global histories, right? In interesting or in popular ways. I mean, sometimes in academic ways and sometimes in fairly unwarranted popular ways. But I think we have to think globally, right? And not regionally, not nationally, that there are these vast connections that we have to be aware of.
Shankar Verma, a research fellow of Christ University, is trying to quote Walter Benjamin and Range, and I'll read it out for you, sir. To articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it the way it really was. It means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. Walter Benjamin and Range, he was just quoting them.
Shankar, you're preaching to the converted. I'm a huge admirer of Walter Benjamin's work, and I think Walter Benjamin sums it up. That when I ended the first section of my talk, the history is not really about the past. It's about what the present recognizes in the past as being important for it. So to take, for example, to give you a simple example of what Walter Benjamin speaks about here. The 1918 pandemic, right? The flu pandemic was largely a forgotten episode. Who knew about it? But with COVID, suddenly we have reached back to a moment, right? Everybody knows about the 1918 flu pandemic right now because of COVID, because that was the last time when human society was affected, and to such a large extent. And David Arnold's, those of you who are interested, you can read David Arnold's wonderful article, which came out last year, on the 1918 epidemic, which actually talks about the social fissures that emerged within India. And it's kind of uncanny how the kind of resonances of caste and of class and of the disruption of families, the disruption of labor, all of these were happening in 1918 just as much as they're happening in 2020, when we can see the Indian society in its barest, right? Where it's very clear that in India there has been a huge abandonment of the subaltern, the huge abandonment of labor. It's a society, we've been shown as a society lacking in compassion, not that we needed further evidence of that, but under COVID, it's perfectly clear that this is true. But you also realize that in 1918, equally this was true, right?
The last question was the final question, sir. I hope there are no more questions. So we are wrapping up our today's lecture program, and I would like to welcome Ansu Matthew, doctoral candidate of the Department of History, to propose the vote of thanks.
Good evening to all. It was the fourth lecture of the international workshop. Professor Dilip Menon, the Mellon Chair in Indian Studies at the University of Witwatersrand and the Director of the Center for Indian Studies in South Africa, gave an excellent lecture on the Colonial Archive and beyond. The talk was indeed a wonderful and insightful account on the way archives have been constituted and the importance to move beyond colonial archive. Sir, your talk was insightful for us, and we expect that it will be reflected in the research works, especially those who are dealing with modern period. On the behalf of Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi and KCHR, I extend my gratitude to Professor Dilip Menon for such an informative lecture. Thank you, sir. I also
thank you all of you. It was good to meet former students, relatives, friends, all of whom were lurking in the background. and thank you for your patience. I mean, there's still 73 of you left who are hanging in.
I also express my gratitude to others who are present here and actively participated in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dilip and Menon. Thank you all. Ma'am, do you wish to say something, ma'am?
No, I'm just thanking you. He's been here for 2 hours and it's exceeded time. Must be. Thank you so much.
No, it's a pleasure. I mean,
Yes.
so can I sign off now? So what shall I?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm
Thank you.
exiting. Thank you all for your patience.
Bye.
And
bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. So here ends the first session of our international lecture series, and let's meet again on 8th October for our 5th section. Thank you.